A while back I made a video about Michael Chekhov, a Russian theatre maker, and I just want to return to some of those ideas because I've been thinking about them again, partly because where I'm working now is at Dartington, where Michael Chekhov used to work himself when he was in Britain in the 1920s and 30s, I think it was, something like that. He set up the theatre school down there. But the bit that I'm interested in is what he's probably most famous for, which is what he called the psychological gesture. And just as a bit of background, Chekhov, who was the nephew of Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright associated with the Moscow Arts Theatre, he's coming out of an acting and directing and playwriting tradition which is very concerned with psychological naturalism. That's the deal, really. It's not something that has a lot of currency in contemporary experimental theatre, which is something I know a bit more about. But he is quite influential, I think, in that, as I say, that naturalistic tradition. And this thing he's got about the psychological gesture, it's one of a whole raft of ideas and methods and training programs and concepts which informs how he taught theatre and how he worked with actors. And he worked with some quite famous actors, not just stage actors in the UK, but also when he left Dartington he went to Hollywood and worked with people like Marilyn Monroe. So he has got some credibility beyond the relatively small confines of the English stage. So what am I talking about? Oh yeah, so a psychological gesture. So the idea of the psychological gesture, just as one example of that, is this thing he had that, well, it's probably best explained by an exercise that he does, or used to do, which is that if you're reading a play, and I'll talk about plays right now, but I think it has application outside of theatre into more general kind of life skills. But anyway, when you're reading a play, he says, you identify the kind of emotional content of a line. You know, what kind of emotional state, if you like, is your character in at that particular moment. And then you devise a gesture which captures that state in some way. So a really simple example would be that, you know, if you've got this character saying a line and your character has kind of pent up anger at that moment, the gesture might be banging your fist on the table really hard. The line itself doesn't necessarily need to express that anger. The line of text that you're supposed to read at that moment might be completely bland or might be relatively innocuous. But if the idea is that, as I say, this inner emotional state is one of anger, then the psychological gesture represents that inner emotional subtext, if you like. So the idea is that you would say this line repeatedly whilst banging your fist on the table. You just keep going over it again and again and again. So the words you're saying are delivering the text, and your body, expressed through this psychological gesture, is saying the subtext, which is this anger. And then what you do is you slowly withdraw the gesture. You don't bang the table as hard, you soften it, you minimise it, you take it away bit by bit, until it's either not perceptible at all or barely perceptible. And the idea is there that the remnants of that gesture kind of remain. There's still some slight traces of it left, even though it's not identifiable. You certainly, as a watcher of this activity, you wouldn't see a person banging the table, but it would carry its traces in the delivery of that line. It would carry traces in terms of the set of your muscles, in the intonation with which you deliver the line, the kind of tautness of your muscles around your throat, so that the words would come out slightly differently. The breathing patterns would be slightly different. So all these really quite tiny traces, detailed traces of this complex coordinated gesture stay behind and inform the line. With the assumption being that a watcher of this stuff would, on a subconscious level presumably, still be able to get some kind of a sense of that. They may not be aware that they're getting a sense of that, but they would be on some level that would be communicated. And it's quite likely that will be the case, I think. What I find quite interesting about that is the relationship between that kind of scheme, that understanding, this idea that what we say and what we think has some kind of representation in the body. I think there's an interesting relationship between that and some of the more recent findings in cognitive science, cognitive linguistics, and particularly things like conceptual metaphor theory, which is something that I'm really interested in. The idea of conceptual metaphor theory, it's played out in people like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's work, is that thinking, any kind of thinking that's at all abstract or complex, involves the mobilization of a set of metaphors. So that, and those are completely embodied metaphors. They're not weird, airy, fairy stuff. They're absolutely the stuff of the body. So when I'm using a word like grasping to mean grasping an idea, to mean understanding, on some level, on some cognitive level, the same kind of neuronal activity, the same cognitive activity is being mobilized there, that when I'm actually physically grasping an object. And in fact, I would quite often do that with my body. If I'm talking about understanding something, I would quite often make a gesture, without even thinking about it, a gesture of grasping. And in fact, I would change the type of grasping I would do according to the kind of understanding that I'm doing. So if I'm grasping quite a fine, if I'm grasping quite a fine point and nuanced, detailed piece of understanding, I would quite often do this kind of gesture with my fingers, as if I'm holding a tiny screwdriver or a little tiny, quite fragile article. Whereas if I'm trying to understand a very large, global concept, I'll make much larger gestures. Again, as if I'm trying to grasp something, literally grasp something much larger. So it seems like what I'm doing there is I'm kind of coming at psychological gestures from the other end. Kind of approaching what Chekhov's talking about. But rather than approaching it from the level of the verbal expression downwards into the kind of emotional logic for that, and then into the physical representation of that logic, I'm kind of working the other way up, starting from the logic of an embodied being working in three-dimensional space with physical objects, and then moving up that into the kind of cognitive and psychological implementations of that, and that eventually finding its way out in terms of the expressions that I have, either expressions in terms of intonation. So when I'm talking about global concepts and big ideas, I find that I find my words inflected by that concept. So I kind of, it's almost as if I'm carrying something big when I say the words. And little tiny objects, I can kind of feel my physiology wrapping itself around something tiny and small. So I feel as if I've gone the other direction to what Chekhov's talking about. I don't know if that makes any sense. I just think there's something quite interesting about the relationship there between Chekhov's understanding of the psychological gesture, where the physiology of the body acts as a subtext to the verbal expression, and conversely this idea that comes out of conceptual metaphor theory, where the verbal expression is underpinned by a set of metaphorical, physiological understandings, which absolutely do have physical instantiation in their expression.